Good morning, everybody. So good to have you here today. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are joining us by video at our Clark Summit campus to the north or at our Wilkes-Barre campus to the south, or those of you who are just watching online wherever you happen to be. Great to have you here for week number 2 in this series called Half-Truths. And during this series of messages, what we're doing is we're examining some well-known statements that have an element of truth to them, but they're just not 100% accurate. These are spiritual-sounding statements that we just kind of hear and accept and repeat without thinking about them very critically. And here, well, like I said last week, a half-truth can be kind of a dangerous thing because there's enough truth in it to make it sound believable, but there's also enough error in it to really mess up your life if you embrace it. And so today, as we continue this series, we're going to be talking about this half-truth. God will never give you more than you can handle. And that sounds so comforting and it sounds so hopeful, but the question is that really true? So as we talk about this statement today, let me invite you to take out that connection card that you received when you came in. There's a great place to take some notes. And I would encourage you, if nothing else, I would encourage you to write down maybe 1 or 2 ideas that God really impresses on your heart, that you want to think about further this week and that you want to put into action this week. But before we jump in and talk about this half-truth, I need to take a couple of minutes and just tell you about some things that are coming up in September. And I know we're not even halfway through August yet, but we do need to talk about September because here at church, we discovered that September is the month of the year when we see our biggest jump in attendance. It's when people's vacations are over and our kids are going back to school and we all get back into the routines of life. And September is really, we discovered, an ideal time to invite somebody to come to church with you. And we want to make that as easy as possible. And so we're going to be launching a brand new series right after Labor Day weekend. This series is called Insomnia. And during this series, we're going to be talking about the stuff that really keeps us awake at night. And you know, we live in a culture where people are so full of worry and so full of fear and so stressed out. And so during this series, we're going to be talking about those things that really keep your mind turning and your stomach churning at times. Here are some of the topics. Why is this world so messed up? Will my kids turn out okay? I mean, that keeps a parent awake at night. Does my life really matter? Will I ever feel forgiven? Like, how do I deal with the shame and the guilt of my past that just kind of haunts me? Or why is this happening to me? Why is my life sometimes seemingly so unfair? And I share this with you because I want you to be thinking even now about who you might be able to invite to come with you when we launch this new series on September 10th and 11th. Maybe it's somebody who lives in your neighborhood. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe somebody in your sphere of relationships, a friend of yours. But who is it that you'd love to see sitting next to you when we begin this series in September? Start thinking about that now. We'll give you some invite cards in the weeks to come. Also, coming up in September on Labor Day weekend, we will be launching our Saturday service. And I mention this again because we do still need some people to volunteer in several different areas. We're still looking for about 15 more volunteers in our kids' ministries and our kids' programming. Man, that's a great way to make a huge difference by touching the future, by investing in the next generation. That is a great place to serve. We also need 4 or 5 more people in the guest services area. We also need 4 more lighting and media techs serving in the booth at the back. That would be real helpful if you got some of those skills. And we also need some people who can just plain cook. Because one of the things we'll be doing on Saturdays is we're providing a simple dinner for everyone who volunteers for the Saturday service. And that right there may be some incentive for you to jump in. But if not, if you like to cook and you can provide a simple dish on a Saturday night for our volunteers, that's a great way for you to volunteer. And by the way, even if Saturday night isn't a good time for you to get involved, pick another service. Because listen, coming into September, we really believe we need all hands on deck. We need a whole bunch of crew members and not just passengers. And here's what we kind of expect from everybody who's a part of Parker Hill. What we encourage you to do is to worship one, serve one. In other words, take an hour a week and worship and engage with the heart of God and with God's truth, but then take another hour a week and just serve others, advance God's kingdom. And we need everybody to do this because we have a big vision ahead of us. God has given us a big mission to accomplish. And if we're going to do that, we need a whole bunch of people who will move beyond just that, 1 hour a week kind of commitment to church. And besides, I believe there's no better investment than to invest your time in advancing God's kingdom through the church, because the church is the hope of the world. And we all need to invest in things, I think, that are going to outlive us, things that really, really do matter. So if you're ready to get off the bench and into the game, here's how you can let us know that on the connection card. Check the box right now that says start serving, and then tear that off. And then when you leave here today, leave that at the next steps area. We'll start that conversation and find a way to help you get plugged in and become part of the crew as we move into September. Okay, that's coming up. So for today, let's jump into this second half-truth. God will never give you more than you can handle. And this is a phrase probably all of us have heard. And this is something typically that we say when someone we know is going through a very difficult time. And we want to give them some comfort, want to give them some hope. And so we just kind of throw this out there. God will never give you more than you can handle. And if you ever see this like on Facebook or in a text message, it's probably going to have the little smiley face with a halo emoji after it, you know. But here's the question. I mean, that sounds really nice, but is it true? And the answer is no, it isn't 100% true. There's some truth to it, no doubt. But there's also a lot of problems with this statement right here. And when I thought about this statement, I thought, you know, this is kind of like one of those songs where the lyrics always get misunderstood. You know what I'm talking about? Where there's what the writer of the song wrote, but then there's what everybody hears. In fact, a couple of years ago, Jimmy Fallon from The Tonight Show, he invited all of his viewers to tweet and to give examples of misunderstood or misheard song lyrics with the hashtag misheard lyrics. And here's some of the things that people sent in. One guy says, "My dad thought America the Beautiful ended with from sea to Chinese sea, America the Beautiful." And then there's that classic song by CCR, Bad Moon Rising. It goes like this: "Don't go around tonight, well, it's bound to take your life because there's a bathroom on the right." Yeah, we all sing it that way, like, don't we? And then that song by Johnny Nash, "I Can See Clearly Now," which goes like this: "I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. I can see all popsicles in my way." Yeah, you got to watch out for the popsicles. And then one more, this one. When I was young, I thought the Lion King song started with Pennsylvania. Yeah, you mean it doesn't, you know? But my point is this, that this half-truth that we're talking about today, it's kind of like a song where nobody really hears the lyrics right. Because there's what the Bible actually says, and then there's what we think it says. And so for this phrase, my goal, I'll tell you right up front, my goal is to try to convince you to strike this from your vocabulary. And here's why. There's a couple of reasons why I don't think you should say this to somebody who's going through a difficult time in life. Number one, this is not helpful. I mean, we think it's helpful, but usually it isn't very helpful. And I want you to think about how someone who's gone through a painful time might hear this. Like, even think about the first part of the phrase, God will never give you. So somebody hearing this might say, wait a minute, are you saying God gave me cancer? Are you saying God gave me, a rapist? Are you saying God caused my husband to beat me? Because the way this is phrased, it sounds as if whatever difficult circumstances come into your life, God gave them to you. And yet we know that God can't be the author of evil. And so this can sometimes be kind of confusing. It might even make somebody feel angry. But I think this also can make people feel guilty, because somebody can hear this and they can say, if God won't give me more than I can handle, and if I can't handle this, does that mean there's something wrong with me? Like, is my faith not strong enough? Am I not tough enough? Am I not working hard enough? I mean, it can make people feel guilty. And I think, inadvertently, without intending to, we can even make people feel kind of isolated, because one thing I don't like about this statement is the emphasis on you, like you can handle, which kind of fits in with our cultural values of extreme independence and self-reliance, like I don't need anybody else. And so somebody can hear this and they can think, well, I guess I should be able to handle this on my own. Maybe I just need to deal with this, and stop complaining. See, I just don't think this is a very helpful thing to say. But even beyond that, not only is this not helpful, I'd say this is not even true. It's just not. In fact, when you read through the Bible, here's what you discover. You discover that there are people in the Bible, I mean, some of the big names, some of the most famous people in the Bible, who faced circumstances that they really couldn't handle. Like, I'll give you an example. Moses would be one example. Moses was the guy who, led the people of Israel from Egypt in slavery to the promised land, and they were constantly complaining and complaining and complaining. And finally, it just got to be too much for Moses. And here's what he says. He's praying. He's talking to God. He said, I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. He says, if this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. Like, kill me now. He couldn't handle it. And then a little later on, there's a prophet by the name of Elijah. And Elijah was a man who was very devoted to God, but he felt like he was living in a culture where no one else was willing to stand up against the forces of evil. And he gets so exhausted, and he just gets physically and spiritually worn out. And here's what happens to him. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. Obviously, he couldn't handle it anymore. And then another prophet, a little bit later on, his name was Jeremiah, and Jeremiah spoke a really strong message to very hard-hearted people, and they didn't always respond well to his message. And Jeremiah was physically beaten up. He was one time thrown into a well and left for dead. And finally, he comes to a breaking point, and he says this. He says, cursed be the day I was born. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow? Like he couldn't handle it anymore. And then Paul, Paul was the leader of the early church. And he writes about a time in one of his letters where he and Timothy, the guy who was traveling with him, had gone through so much trouble and so much difficulty that he says this. He says, we were under great pressure far beyond our ability to endure, far beyond our ability to handle it, so that we despaired of life itself. Do you see a theme here? I mean, listen, if you've ever felt like life had given you too much to handle, you're not alone. I mean, some of the most devoted servants of God in the Bible got to a point in their lives where they just felt like the circumstances they were facing were just too much to handle. So, if this phrase, if this half-truth isn't helpful, and if it isn't even true to begin with, then why is it so popular, and why do we think it's true? Well, I'll tell you the reason for that. It all stems from one verse in the Bible that really gets misunderstood. It's like, the misheard song lyrics. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. And this is Paul writing to the believers in the city of Corinth. He says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So obviously, he was talking here not about trials, not about suffering, not about the problems in life. He's talking about temptation. In fact, let me give you some of the background to what he was writing here. Again, this is a letter, first century letter, written to Christians in a church living in the city of Corinth, and so they were called Corinthians. And so Paul writes this letter to them, and the city of Corinth was very interesting. It was a large city, and it was a seaport city, and it was located on a piece of land called an isthmus, and this is about 5 miles across. Now, what they did in Corinth was they developed a way for cargo and ships to be transported from the Sardonic Gulf on this side to the Gulf of Corinth on the other side. Very fascinating. What they did was they built a road, and then this road that traversed those 5 miles of land on the isthmus, they built these special carts that would actually be able to carry a ship from one body of water to the other body of water. So if you were sailing from the Aegean Sea over to the Indian Ocean, you could save weeks of time at sea if you would just go across the isthmus here on this system that they had built there in Corinth. Now, there's a canal there today. But here's what that brought about. That meant that in the city of Corinth, there were people coming and going constantly. And so there were people there in the city of Corinth who were far from home and far from all the restraints that come with family and community. And so this was kind of like the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire, okay? It's kind of like what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth, okay? That was the kind of city that it was. A lot of people coming and going. And then they had this temple in the city of Corinth. You can still see the ruins of it today. This was a temple that was built to the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And the pagan worship that took place in this temple, believe it or not, involved ritual prostitution. And so there were prostitutes that plied their trade inside this temple and all over the streets of Corinth, and they did this like openly. And so you got to understand, this was a city that was very, very dark morally and spiritually. And so you got this little group of Christians there in the city constantly surrounded by temptation and giving into temptation. Then they would rationalize their giving into temptation, and they would say things like, what do you expect? We live in Corinth. This is how it's done in Corinth, and we can't stand up under the pressure here in Corinth. We just can't. And so Paul writes this letter, and he says, listen, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So that's the context behind this verse of Scripture. Now, I want to stop here for like 4 or 5 minutes, because I don't want to just skip over this and keep going with the message, because I think there's some important truth here about temptation, even though temptation isn't specifically what we're talking about today. And maybe for some of you, like, this is why God brought you to church today, or this is why you're hearing this online. Let me tell you 3 simple facts about temptation whenever you're tempted. Number 1 is this: your temptation is not unique. Because no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. Because here's what we tend to say. We tend to say, you know what? Nobody has ever had to deal with what I have to deal with. My circumstances are unique, and if anybody else ever had to deal with my circumstances and deal with the temptation that I have to deal with, well, they certainly would have responded in the same way. No, that's not true. Listen, there are lots of other people that have difficult marriages and who work at it every day. There are lots of other people who deal with addictions and habits that they struggle with on a constant basis. There are lots of other people out there just like you who struggle with sexual temptation. There are lots of other people out there who struggle with anger or whatever it is that you might struggle with. You're not unique, and you're not alone. The second truth about temptation is this: that you never have to give in. You never have to give in, never, because God is faithful and He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. So, I couldn't help it is a phrase that a follower of Christ should never use. And the number 3 fact about temptation is simply this: that there's always a way of escape, because God will always provide a way out. You can bite your tongue. You can walk away. You can focus your mind on something else. You can call up a friend on the phone. There is always a way of escape. My problem is I'm not looking for a way of escape usually. I'm looking for a way to rationalize what I want to do. Let me tell you the best way of escape. The best way of escape is to understand what your greatest temptations are and then stay far away from them to begin with. That is the best way of escape. And oftentimes when I talk about temptation or resisting temptation, I think about the no candy lane at the grocery store. Have you ever seen these? Like, I think this was one of the best inventions ever, because you can go through the checkout line and you don't have racks of gum and candy right at the eye level of your kids. And my wife, she used to love the no candy lane, because then, it would prevent all the pleading and begging and crying that would go on. And sometimes it would get so bad that she would actually just kind of give in to keep the peace. She would give in and buy me some candy. But, then the no candy lane came along, and it's great because you don't even get near the temptation. Now, you don't even have to fight it. You just avoid it. And I think one of the best ways to escape temptation is just don't get near it to begin with. Like, maybe there's a different route you can drive to get to work. Or maybe you just need to shut down your social media account or change your phone number. Maybe you need to start using your computer in the living room or in the kitchen, not in the privacy of your office or your bedroom. See, when it comes to the temptation, there are 3 facts here. It's not unique. You never have to give in, never, and there's always a way of escape. And I say this because I want you to understand that this phrase, God will never give you more than you can handle, is actually 100% true when it comes to temptation. Like, you can use that phrase, but just use it on yourself. Like, the next time you're tempted, you just say to yourself, you have a little conversation with yourself, and you say, Mark, I know you're tempted, but God will never give you more than you can handle. You're not unique. You don't have to give in, and there is a way out. So God will never give you more than you can handle is certainly true when it comes to temptation. But here's the thing. When it comes to suffering, when it comes to trials, when it comes to all the pain of this world, the Bible actually doesn't say God will never give you more than you can handle. I mean, I've looked, I've searched, it's not there. But here's the thing. I believe the Bible and God give us an even greater promise. And the greater promise is this, that whatever you face in life, even if what you face in life is greater than what you can handle on your own, whatever you face in life, you don't have to face it alone. You don't have to handle it alone if you are one of God's children. You're not in it by yourself. And in fact, one of the ways where you see this truth, one of the places where you see this truth most clearly is in a very, very familiar passage of Scripture. Probably all of you have heard Psalm 23. You know Psalm 23. It was written by David, the king of Israel. He grew up as a shepherd boy. And he writes about, God's people as his sheep, and God is like the perfect shepherd. And it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." And then you come to verse 4 and it says this, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." And I love this verse. And I think it becomes really even more powerful when you understand it clearly. Because in our day, in our culture, when we think of a valley, this is what we think of, right? Kind of rolling hills, fertile green, landscape. It's a very peaceful scene. But in David's time and in biblical times and in that culture, this is what a valley looked like. We might call this a ravine. They actually called this a wadi. But a valley, as David described it, it had these very tall canyon walls that were very steep. And the sun would only shine directly into the wadi, into the valley, for about 2 hours a day, right around noon. So for the rest of the day, the valley was covered in shadows. It was a valley of shadows, and it was a very, very dangerous place because lions and wolves would wait in the caves and in the rocks of these hillsides. And always there would be a stream down in the wadi, in the valley, and animals would come down to drink water, and they would be attacked by the lions and the wolves that were waiting for them. And if you were sheep in here, basically you had nowhere to run. The valley was a very dangerous, fearful place. It was a place where you could die if you were sheep. I mean, it was a place that would be more than you could handle. And here's what David says. He doesn't say, "God, because you're my shepherd, I never walk through the valley of the shadow of death." No, he says, "I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but I don't fear any evil because you are with me." And here's the thing, in your life and in my life, there are a lot of dark valleys that we could possibly go through, and we do go through them. There's the valley of failure. There's the dark valley of a broken relationship. There's that dark valley of unemployment that some of you are struggling with right now, and it feels so dark, and the shadows seem so deep. There's the valley that's called addiction. There's the dark valley of a terminal illness. And then, of course, there's the ultimate valley itself, that is death itself. And David here doesn't say, "God, because you're my shepherd, I'll never walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I'll never have to face anything difficult." He doesn't say that. He kind of assumes that it will happen. He just says this, that when I'm there, you're with me. Okay? So let me give you a better phrase. When somebody you know is going through a difficult time, instead of saying, "God will never give you more than you can handle," you just say this, "God will help you handle whatever you've been given." See, that's really different. That's a very different picture. That's not God standing back and kind of dishing out the pain and the suffering until you get just to that point where you can hardly bear it anymore. This is God walking alongside of us, bearing it with us, healing us, encouraging us. Not God will never give you more than you can handle, but God will help you handle whatever life gives you. And let me even take this a step further. I would say this, and this is so counterintuitive, but I would say that I'm glad there are times when we have more than we can handle. Because there are some very good things that happen in our lives when we find ourselves in a position where life has given us more than we can handle. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. When we have more than we can handle, do you know what happens? Number one is it deepens our faith. Let me go back to Paul and what he wrote in the second letter to the church, to the believers in Corinth. I quoted some of this earlier. He says, describing what he and Timothy had gone through, he says, "We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." But now listen to this. He says, "But this happened." Why? "That we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." You know what I've discovered in my own life? That it's in times of loss, it's in times of struggle, it's in times of pain that I learn to rely on the God who is all-powerful. That's when my heart is drawn to His heart. But listen, when life is going well, when there's no struggle, when everything is fine, do you know what happens to us? Our hearts begin to drift away from God. Our faith gets a little bit colder. That relationship becomes a little bit more distant. And it's interesting around here, every time we do baptisms, we get to hear people tell about the story of their own spiritual journey. And there's one theme that comes up so frequently. You'll hear people say, it's when I hit bottom. It's when she walked away. It's when the business fell apart. It's when the diagnosis came from the doctor. It's when I couldn't break the addiction. It's when I hit bottom. That's when I turned my attention toward God. Because here's the thing. When life gives us more than we can handle, that's when we run to God. That's when we run to His embrace. And that's when our faith gets much deeper. Let me tell you a second thing that happens. It shapes our character. When life gives us more than we can handle, when we have more than we can handle ourselves, it shapes our character. I mean, you ask anybody to look back over their life and describe the events and the times and the seasons in life that really shaped them and made them who they are. People won't tell the story about the big job promotion, right? They're not going to tell the story about the pay raise that they got. They're not going to talk about that season of life when everything was going just really well and everything was like perfect for them. No, if you ask people to talk about the times in life that really grew them and shaped their character and developed them into the people that they are today, they'll talk about the pain and they'll talk about the struggle and they'll talk about the trial when it seemed like they couldn't handle it anymore. That's when they really grew. Let me kind of illustrate this for you. Back in the 1980s, there was a group of scientists that built this large, self-contained environment called the biosphere. I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but there were 8 people who lived in this thing for 2 years. It was a really crazy experiment, and it didn't necessarily go very well. But there's 3 acres of land inside this glass and plastic dome, and they were able to replicate almost every part of the natural environment inside the biosphere. But there was one thing that they were not able to create inside the biosphere. They couldn't create wind in there. And it was very interesting. After a couple of years, they discovered that the trees inside the biosphere, they wouldn't grow without wind, because wind is what strengthens a tree and helps it to become stronger and deeply rooted. And so what would happen is the trees would grow to a certain height, and then under their own weight they would begin to bend, and then they would just break off because there was no wind. They needed the wind to keep them strong. Now here's my point. What's true about trees is also true about the human soul. Strong character is only developed in times of struggle. That's when we are shaped. That's when our hearts are molded. That's when we really develop into the people that God is calling us to be. But people who never go through stress, people who never struggle, people who never mourn, people who are never stretched, oftentimes become shallow, self-centered, Kardashian kind of people. I probably shouldn't have said that. But when we have more than we can handle, it shapes our character. It deepens our faith, it shapes our character, and one more thing, it refocuses our attention. See, here's one of the great blessings of finding yourself in a situation where you have more than you can handle. One of the great blessings of that is this. It reminds us that this world is not our true home anyway. And what pain and suffering and hardship will do is it will pry our attention away from all of the temporary things of this world and refocus our attention on our one true home. And Paul, again, writing to the believers in the city of Corinth, this time in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and just prior to this part that he wrote, he describes all the suffering that he had been through. like being shipwrecked, being hungry, the beatings, the imprisonment, everything that he had been through. And then he says this, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes, we turn our attention, we refocus our attention, not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And there are a couple of words that just really catch my attention every time I read this. The words light and momentary, light and momentary. And listen, this guy knew what troubles were. He had a very difficult life, especially when he became a follower of Christ. But he said, listen, in comparison to the eternal glory that's waiting for us, our troubles in this world, they are light and momentary. And you know what? When life gets difficult, when you've got more than you can handle, you're reminded of that our true home is in heaven. And there's nothing on this earth that can compare with that. And so when you go to work tomorrow and work is tough and your boss is difficult, you just say to yourself under your breath, light and momentary. When you go home and then your spouse comes home and the car is like 2 feet shorter than when they left with the car, you don't get mad. You just say, you know what? Light and momentary. And when life is painful and it's not measuring up to your expectations and the hurt is deep, when you're ready to give in, hey, light and momentary. Because listen, if you put our current sufferings on one side of the scale and you put the weight of eternal glory on the other side of the scale, there is no comparison. So listen, it is not necessarily a bad thing to have more than you can handle. In some ways, it's a very good thing because listen, when we have more than we can handle, that's when our faith gets deeper, that's when our character is shaped, and that's when our attention is refocused on where it ought to be focused anyway. So listen, next time you've got somebody in your life who's struggling and you want to give some encouragement to them, don't say God will give you more than you can handle. That's not helpful. It's not even really true. I mean, you can say that to yourself when you're facing temptation, but the next time you're talking to somebody who's really struggling with something, just say this. Say, God will help you handle whatever you've been given. In fact, let me even take it a step further. You could say this. God will help you handle whatever you've been given, and so will I. See, that's the whole truth and not a half truth.